The bite of the late autumn air was sharp against his skin, a familiar New York chill that did nothing to cool the calculated precision of his thoughts. Ryu walked with a stillness that commanded the space around him, the city's chaos parting before him like water before the bow of a ship. Beside him, Akemi's chatter was a delicate, musical counterpoint to the rumble of traffic, a pleasantry he had learned to file away without processing. Her hand was tucked into the crook of his arm, her diamond engagement ring catching the last of the day's light, a symbol of the alliance her family represented. It was a good match, a sensible one. It would solidify his territory on both continents. He was looking at the reflection of the streetlights in a darkened storefront window when he saw her. The world tilted on its axis, the sounds of the city fading to a dull, distant roar. 7 years had passed, but time had done nothing to soften the image of her. Lena. Her dark jacket was zipped high against the cold, her shoulders set with a familiar, stubborn strength. She was not alone. On either side of her, holding her hands, were 2 small girls in matching gray woolen dresses. Their faces were turned up toward her, their expressions serious as they navigated the crowded sidewalk. Ryu stopped. Akemi took another step before realizing he was no longer beside her.
Ryu?
What is it? He did not hear her. He could not look away. One of the little girls laughed, a bright, sudden sound, and she tilted her head back. For a split second, her profile was illuminated by the neon sign of a noodle shop. It was his profile. The same high cheekbones, the same stubborn set of her jaw. He looked at the other girl. She had his eyes. Dark, almond-shaped, and unnervingly perceptive. They were looking right at him. Something cold and heavy settled in his gut. 7 years. He had severed the connection with surgical precision, a clean cut to save her from the poison of his world. He had burned the bridge and salted the earth, convincing himself it was an act of honor. A necessary sacrifice. He had left her with nothing but a memory, or so he had thought. Ryu. Akemi's voice was sharper now, laced with impatience. He pulled his arm from her grasp without a word, his focus absolute. He stepped off the curb, the traffic screeching to a halt around him. Horns blared, but the sound was irrelevant. He crossed the street, his eyes locked on Lena.
She saw him then.
Her step faltered, her hand tightening on her daughter's hands. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin ashen under the streetlights. Fear, stark and immediate, flashed in her eyes, followed by a wave of something harder, something he recognized as the defiance that had drawn him to her in the first place. He stopped a few feet from her. He did not need to get closer to see the truth. It was carved into the faces of the children staring up at him. His children. Lena, he said. Her name felt foreign on his tongue, a relic from a life he had buried. She flinched, a barely perceptible tremor. Ryu. What are you doing here? Her voice was low, strained. She pulled the girls closer, a protective gesture that was as futile as it was instinctual. A question I should be asking you, he replied, his voice dangerously soft. He let his gaze drift from her face down to the 2 silent, wide-eyed children. He crouched down, not to their level, but enough to see them properly. They did not shrink away. They watched him with a solemn curiosity that sent a tremor through him. What are your names? He asked them, his voice losing none of its edge. The one with his eyes spoke first.
I'm Hannah.
This is my sister, Sora. Sora and Hannah. Sky and flower. He looked back up at Lena, the cold fury in his chest so intense it was difficult to breathe. They are 6, he stated. It was not a question. Lena's chin lifted. They will be 7 in 2 months. 7. The math was simple. Unforgivable. He had left, and she had carried his legacy in secret, hiding his bloodline from him for 7 years. The betrayal was a physical blow. He rose to his full height, the silence between them stretching thin and taut. A black town car, sleek and silent as a shark, pulled up to the curb beside them. His driver did not need to be told. Get in the car, Ryu said.
No.
His eyes narrowed. That was not a request. You will get in the car. You will bring my daughters. And you will explain to me why I am only just now learning of their existence. Across the street, Akemi stood watching, a porcelain doll frozen in a tableau of confusion and dawning horror. Ryu did not even glance her way. She was part of a life that had ceased to exist the moment he saw his own eyes staring back at him from a child's face. Lena looked from his unyielding expression to the imposing car, then down at her daughters. She knew him. She knew this was not a negotiation. Her shoulders slumped in a gesture of defeat that was not surrender, but a strategic retreat. "All right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't frighten them." He opened the back door himself, a gesture that was both a courtesy and a command. She guided the girls inside, their small bodies swallowed by the plush leather interior. She slid in after them, positioning herself between them like a shield. Ryu got in on the other side, the door closing with a heavy, final thud that sealed them inside. The car pulled smoothly into traffic, leaving Akemi and the life he was supposed to have behind on the cold, unforgiving sidewalk. The girls were silent, their small hands clutching Lena's. He could feel the tension radiating from her, a mix of fear and anger that was almost palpable in the enclosed space. He said nothing, letting the silence do the work for him. They drove through the glittering canyons of Manhattan, the city lights a blur of indifferent beauty. He was taking her to his territory, a place she could not run from. "You have a great deal to explain," he said finally, his voice a low murmur that cut through the hum of the engine. "And you will not be leaving until I am satisfied with your answers." The promise was absolute, a cage of steel and glass settling around her before they even arrived. She had thought she had escaped him. She was wrong. She had only been living on borrowed time. The penthouse was a sterile masterpiece of glass and steel, perched high above the city. It was a king's observation deck, cold and impersonal, designed for power, not comfort. Lena stood in the center of the vast living room, her arms wrapped around herself as if to ward off the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Ryu had his men take the girls to another room, a suite filled with toys and distractions that had likely been conjured from thin air. The door had closed, separating her from them, and the click of the latch had sounded like a prison gate. "Why?" he asked. The single word hung in the air, heavy with accusation. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a silhouette against the glittering skyline. "Why do you think?" She shot back, her fear finally giving way to the anger that had been simmering beneath. "You disappeared, Ryu. No note, no call. One day you were there, and the next you were a ghost. I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks later. What was I supposed to do? Take out an ad? Searching for Yakuza boss who abandoned me?" He turned from the window, his face a mask of cold fury. "You could have tried. And brought this into their lives?" She gestured around the opulent cage. "This world of violence and secrets? I chose to give them a normal life. A safe 1 inch. You chose to lie," he corrected, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper as he crossed the room toward her. He stopped just inches away, forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "You stole 7 years from me. You stole my right to know my own children. There is no honor in that." The word honor was a slap. "Don't you dare talk to me about honor," she hissed. "You, who vanished without a trace because it was convenient for you." A muscle feathered in his jaw. For a moment, she thought he might strike her. Instead, the anger in his eyes was eclipsed by something deeper, something that looked like pain. "It was not convenient," he said, his voice raw. "It was necessary." He turned away from her, walking back to the window. "My father was dying. The Hashimoto clan saw it as an opportunity. They saw my relationship with you, an outsider, as a weakness they could exploit. A vulnerability." He paused, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "They made a move against you. A car was waiting for you outside your apartment. I was the only reason you never reached it." Lena stared at his back, her heart pounding. She remembered that time. A sudden, unexplained sense of being watched. A near miss with a speeding car that she'd brushed off as a typical New York moment. "To protect you, I had to cut you out," he continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Completely. I had to make them believe you meant nothing to me. I had to disappear from your life so you could continue to have 1 inch. He turned to face her again, and the mask was back in place, but she could see the cracks. I told myself it was the only way, the only honorable path. I thought I was saving you. His wound was laid bare. Not just the betrayal he felt, but the shame. The shame of a man who believed his only act of protection was an act of abandonment. He had failed to protect her and stay with her, so he had chosen one. And in doing so, he had lost everything that truly mattered. Before she could process the revelation, his phone buzzed, a sharp, insistent sound. He answered it, his back stiffening as he listened. Where? He snapped. A pause. Understood. He hung up and looked at her, his eyes dark with a new, immediate threat. The Hashimotos. They know I'm in the city. Their New York operation is active again. The danger wasn't in the past. It was here.
It was now.
And he wasn't the only target anymore. His gaze flickered toward the room where the girls were, and a primal fear unlike any he'd shown before crossed his face. He had 2 new vulnerabilities. 2 perfect, innocent targets. He strode out of the room, speaking in rapid, low tones to one of his men in the hallway. This was her chance. A window of opportunity. She could go to the girls' room, grab them, and run. Try to find an exit, scream for help, disappear back into the city. Her every instinct screamed at her to flee, to take her children and vanish again, this time for good. But she stayed. She stood frozen in the center of the room, her mind racing. Running would be a death sentence. They would be hunted. She looked at the door Ryu had disappeared through. He was a monster, a man who lived by a code of violence and death. But he was also the only person who could protect his daughters from the world he had created. Staying was a gamble, but running was a certainty of failure. She made a deliberate choice, not for him, but for Sora and Hannah.
She would stay.
She would face the storm. He came back into the room, the mask of control firmly back in place, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the exhaustion around his eyes. He looked at her, standing exactly where he had left her, and a flicker of surprise crossed his face. He had expected her to run. They know I'm here, he said, his voice grim. He walked toward her, closing the distance until he stood before her again. The space between them crackled with unspoken history and a terrifying, uncertain future. And if they are as thorough as they used to be, they will soon know about you. And about them. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. His presence was a physical weight, a promise of violence, and a strange, unwelcome shield. She had thought keeping his children a secret was protecting them. Now she understood she had only been keeping them safe in a lull before the hurricane. And the hurricane had just made landfall. A sudden, muffled boom from the street below shook the thick plate glass windows of the penthouse. It was followed by the distant sound of a car alarm wailing. A message. A declaration. Lena's breath hitched. The door to the girls' room flew open, and one of Ryu's men stood there, his expression grim, ushering the 2 startled children out. Boss. They were frightened by the noise. Sora ran straight to Lena, burying her face in her legs. But Hannah, ever the curious one, darted toward the massive window, trying to see the commotion on the street below. Hannah, no. Lena cried out. But Ryu was faster. He moved with a predatory grace that defied his size, covering the 20 feet of open floor in a blur of motion. He snatched Hannah away from the window, pulling her small body against his chest just as a faint, almost invisible red swept across the spot on the floor where she had been standing. He spun, shielding her with his own body, his eyes scanning the buildings opposite them. It happened so fast Lena barely had time to register it. A sniper. Whether it was a real threat or his paranoid reaction didn't matter. The possibility was enough. The air turned to ice in her lungs. He had almost lost one of them, right here, in his own fortress. The danger was no longer a conversation. It was a red, dancing on the floor. We're moving, Ryu snapped, his voice a low command that sent his men into a flurry of silent, efficient activity. He held Hannah tight against him, his hand protectively cradling the back of her head. As his men prepared their exit, his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening. Akemi. He ignored it, but it buzzed again.
And again.
A persistent, frantic rhythm. She knows this location, he said to his lieutenant. She's a liability. Handle her. Take her to the airport. Put her on a plane back to Tokyo. Make sure she understands that speaking of this to anyone is not an option. The cold finality in his tone made Lena's blood run cold. Handle her was a euphemism, a sterile phrase for intimidation or worse. She thought of the woman on the sidewalk, confused and abandoned. Akemi was a pawn, just as she was. But she didn't deserve to be a casualty. Give me the phone, Lena said, her voice steady. Ryu looked at her, his expression unreadable. This does not concern you. She'll listen to a woman more than she'll listen to one of your thugs, Lena insisted, holding out her hand. She's scared. Let me handle it. I can make her disappear without a fight. For a long moment, he stared at her, weighing his options. Then, with a curt nod, he handed her the phone. Lena took a deep breath and answered. Hello. Akemi's voice was high-pitched with panic. Who is this? Where is Ryu? This is Lena, she said calmly, pitching her voice to be soothing, confidential. Ryu had to leave. There was an urgent family matter in Kyoto. He asked me to call you. He was worried you would be upset. She walked toward the other side of the room, turning her back to Ryu, creating a small pocket of privacy. She used details she remembered from her time with him, his favorite hotel in Kyoto, the name of a distant cousin, weaving a lie that was intricate and believable. She told Akemi that Ryu wanted her to wait for him at the St. Regis, that he had booked her a suite and would meet her there in 2 days. She was firm, yet kind, the perfect messenger. He is all right? Akemi asked, her voice trembling. He's fine, Lena lied, her own heart hammering against her ribs. He's just handling business. You know how he is. He said not to call him, that it would complicate things. He will call you when it's done. She ended the call and handed the phone back to Ryu. She had done it. She had manipulated another woman, sent her on a fool's errand, and neutralized her as a threat to their escape. She had crossed a moral line she never thought she would approach, all to protect her children. To protect him. There was no going back. The new safe house was a nondescript brownstone in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, the kind of place you would never look at twice. It was anonymous, safe, and suffocating. The girls were finally asleep in a back bedroom, exhausted by the fear and confusion. The adrenaline had faded, leaving Lena and Ryu in a state of raw, frayed tension. They stood in the small kitchen. He was methodically cleaning a handgun, the metallic clicks of the components echoing in the silence. She was making tea, the simple, domestic act a stark contrast to the reality of their situation. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words, with 7 years of anger and a few hours of shared terror. He set the gun down on the counter, the piece of lethal steel looking obscene next to the sugar bowl. 7 years, he said, his voice quiet, rough. Every day for 7 years, I told myself that leaving you was the only honorable thing I ever did, that I saved you from this. He looked up, and his eyes, stripped of their usual cold command, were filled with a profound, aching regret. I see them sleeping in that room. I see my daughters, and I know I was a fool. I didn't save you. I abandoned you. He took a step closer, his gaze locked with hers. And that is a debt I will spend my life repaying. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something deeper, more dangerous. A confession of his soul's deepest failure. An oath. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. A sharp knock at the back door shattered the moment. One of his men entered, carrying a simple cardboard box. This was left with the super. Said it was a delivery for the new tenants. Ryu took the box, his body instantly tense. He placed it on the table and carefully sliced it open. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a small, gray woolen dress, identical to the one Sora and Hannah had been wearing. Beneath it lay a single photograph. It was of Lena, taken that morning as she walked her daughters to school. Hours before she had run into Ryu. The message was brutally clear. They hadn't found her because of him. They were already watching her. She and the girls were never a means to get to him. They were the target all along. The Hashimoto clan sent their terms. A meeting. The head of their New York operation, a man named Kenji, proposed a summit at a neutral location, a closed restaurant in the meatpacking district, to settle the renewed conflict. It was a transparent trap, an execution disguised as diplomacy. Ryu knew it, but he had no choice. They had sent the dress. They had sent the photograph. It was a direct challenge, and to ignore it would be a sign of weakness that would get them all killed. "I'll go," he said, his voice flat. He was standing over a table strewn with maps of the district. "I will be the bait. You and my men will take the girls and head for the Teterboro airport. A plane will be waiting." Lena looked at him, at the grim certainty on his face. He was planning to walk into his own death to buy them a few hours of escape. The thought was unacceptable. She would not be the woman he died for. Not again.
"No," she said.
"This is not a discussion," he stated, not looking up from the maps. "You're right. It's not." While he and his men prepared for war, she slipped away. She had overheard them talking, mentioning names and locations. One name stuck out. A boutique investment firm in Midtown, a name that seemed out of place in their conversation. Kenji Hashimoto's name had been mentioned in the same breath. They thought he was moving money, cleaning it for the clan. She went into a bathroom, locked the door, and pulled out her phone. She had a contact, a financial journalist from a life that felt a century old. A man who owed her a serious favor. Her hands trembled, but her voice was perfectly calm when he answered. She told him she had an anonymous tip. She gave him the name of the firm, the account structures she'd guessed at, and Kenji Hashimoto's name. She painted a vivid picture of a massive money laundering operation, just enough to be irresistible. She was setting a fire, not with a gun, but with information. She was crippling them from the inside. Hours later, the time for the meeting arrived. Ryu left, his face carved from stone. Lena was left in the brownstone with 2 guards and her sleeping children. The silence was a living thing, coiling in her stomach. She could only wait, praying that her gamble had paid off. The sounds of the assault, when they came, were distant, sirens wailing across the city. Not near the brownstone, but further downtown. It was the sound of a different kind of war. It was nearly dawn when he returned. He stumbled through the door, supported by one of his men. His left arm was wrapped in a makeshift, blood-soaked bandage. He was pale, exhausted, but alive. His lieutenant looked at Lena with a newfound respect. The meeting was a setup just like we thought, but they were disorganized. Half their men never showed. Just before we engaged, we heard chatter. Federal agents hit their financial hub. They were in chaos. It's the only reason we're not all dead. Ryu sank into a chair, his gaze finding Lena across the room. He understood. He saw the phone still clutched in her hand. He knew what she had done. She hadn't hidden. She hadn't waited to be rescued. She had entered the war on her own terms and saved him. She went to the kitchen and came back with a first aid kit, kneeling in front of him. She gently unwrapped the bandage, her touch surprisingly steady as she examined the deep gash on his forearm. As she began to clean the wound, he watched her, his expression intense. "Akemi was a contract," he said, his voice rough with pain and exhaustion. "A merger of 2 families. It was business. It was sensible." He paused, his eyes holding hers, demanding she see the truth in them. "You are my home. You and the girls. I have been without a home for 7 years." It was not a proposal. It was not a request for forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement, a statement of fact as solid and immovable as the ground beneath them. He was claiming her, claiming their family, not as a possession, but as the core of his existence. The cost of that claim was steep. Her old life, the quiet, normal world she had built for her daughters, was gone forever. Her name was now linked to his, a liability and a target. Her freedom was the price for their survival. For him, the cost was an open heart in a world of knives. For the first time, He had something to lose that was worth more than his own life. Days later, the city lights of New York were a receding constellation below them. They were on a private jet, heading toward a future she could not yet imagine. The girls were asleep in the seats across the aisle, their breathing soft and even, their faces peaceful in the dim cabin light. They were safe. That was all that mattered. Ryu was not looking at the city or at his sleeping daughters. He was watching her. He had not asked her to come. He had not demanded she stay. Her presence on this plane was the only answer he needed. She had made her choice the moment she made that phone call, the moment she decided to fight for him instead of running from him. He reached across the aisle, his hand covering hers where it rested on the armrest. His touch was not possessive, but a quiet, steady anchor. A promise. She looked down at their joined hands, his scarred and powerful, hers steady and capable, and then back out the window at the last glittering lights of the world she was leaving behind. She had built a life on her own terms, a life of measured safety. Now she was choosing a life defined by danger, by loyalty, by him. It was not a fairy tale ending written in the stars. It was a conscious, difficult beginning, forged in blood and betrayal. And for the first time in a long, long time, it felt like the truth.